Hi, I'm Julie Asher from Recipes for a Sweet Life. There's nothing I love more than something that is both functional and edible, and that's exactly what this cookie project is today. They might look like napkin rings, which they are, but they're also entirely made of cookie. Wouldn't they just be sweet on a Thanksgiving table? That's where I plan to use them. It's also a relatively easy project and doable for kids insofar as it doesn't involve much icing. It's fabricated almost entirely of embossed cookies. I use both a wood grain mat for the sides of the ring and a Wilton fern mat for some of the embellishments on top, as well as some first impressions mats for the flowers and baubles that fill out between the ferns. So ready to try this project with me? Let's get started. Okay, what do we need for this project? It's basically an easy project with two primary cookie parts, the strips of dough that form the halves of the napkin ring, and they've been embossed with a wood grain texture mat, the source of which will be in the video description. I've got a 2.5-inch ring and also a smaller 2-inch ring here. Take your pick. You can make these in a variety of sizes. I like to make them reasonably the size of a napkin ring. I've also got a number of cookie accessories. These are all embossed cookies that will go on top of the napkin ring to cover the seam. First, the ferns using that Wilton mat I mentioned in 2 different dough colors, a sunflower using a first impressions mat, and I'll talk a little bit about how to highlight the center using petal dust. Some additional smaller flowers. These are actually flower centers using another first impressions mat, and red cookie dough. And last but not least, some fondant berries. I talk about how to make all these parts in my woodland cookie box video, so I won't belabor those steps here. I'll do a quick recap only. Let's talk first, though, about how to shape and emboss the cookie rings, as this is a pretty essential part. I like to start by dusting my work surface quite well because I don't want the dough strip to stick to the work surface. And then I roll it in the direction that I want the dough to go. Because I'm cutting a long strip to go around a 2-inch cylinder, I need a piece at least 3 inches long. So I start by rolling that rectangle. Then I'm going to emboss it, and I do not add additional flour at the embossing stage on the mat because any additional flour will toughen the dough, and there's no need to apply it here because the dough will come quite easily off the mat, as you'll see. Now I just want to roll over it again to really make sure I get a nice crisp impression. Invert it, and then carefully peel back the impression mat, and as I told you, it releases quite well without any additional flour. Now, the next step is to cut that strip. I like to use a straight edge or ruler as my guide and just tick off the width of the strip with the tip of my paring knife. These are about 1.25 inch to 1.5 inches wide, depending on the diameter of the ring, and then just cut the other side of the strip. This is where it becomes really important to have dusted the work surface because you want to lift that strip without stretching the piece because that will distort the impression. And you'll see I dusted pretty well, so it comes right off, and I'm lifting it onto my 2-inch cylinder. I'm going to bake on the side of the cylinder. If I were to bake with it vertically on the cylinder, the dough would slump off in the oven and become a big blob. So it's important to bake on the side, and to keep that cylinder steady in the oven, I just rest it in another cookie cutter. Then lift the whole contraption onto the backside of a cookie sheet, bake at 375 for my normal baking time, which is about 10 minutes, or until the edges of my gingerbread are lightly browned. Okay, let's talk about how to get that cool texture into the wood grain to really highlight it. I talk about this again in my woodland box video, but it's such an important step that I'm going to go through it in some detail here in case you missed that video. Before we actually highlight it, though, I do want to make sure there's a nice tight fit, and I do that by filing down the edges using my microplaner, which is nothing more than a food-safe grading tool. You want a pretty tight fit, but you will be covering that with the other cookie flowers and leaves, so it's not critical that it be super perfect. My first step in texturing is to give some depth to the knots of the wood by painting them with a mixture of black food coloring, my liquid gel food coloring, and water. But I don't want that food coloring too wet, so I'm going to blot it off because if it's too wet, it will commingle with the icing I'm going to add in the next step, and I'll get a really smudgy look as opposed to really distinct wood grain texture. Now, the next step is to apply that icing I mentioned, and I like to do that with a flexible spatula like this one or that one, as opposed to a really stiff one. It'll just get into the grooves easier, so I wouldn't use this small, stiff one. Now I'm taking my thick ivory icing and just smushing it into those grooves, really working it in there with a spatula. This is why it's nice to have a flexible one. And again, you don't want that food coloring, the black food coloring, to be at all damp because it'll mix in with the icing and you'll just get a smudge as opposed to really crisp lines. But this is looking pretty good. I'm going to scrape off the excess with the side of my spatula and then take my clean finger and wipe off any roughness so I get a really, really clean look. You can also do this with your spatula. Now you want to let this dry again before applying the next step, which is to give it a little sheen. I always love a little sheen, and here I'm dusting on some brown luster dust. It's a CK Products dust with a dry brush. Now my icing here is a little bit damp in the lower left there. You can see how it's smudged. That's why you want to apply the dust when the icing is dry. You'll get a sheerer application of the dust and it won't look so smudgy. Okay, let's talk about how to do those ferns, flowers, and berries. I've done this extensively in my wood grain cookie box video, which you can see playing in the upper left, so I'm not going to belabor those points there. I'm just going to direct you off to that video to learn how to emboss the dough and also shape the fondant berries. Okay, and on to the fun assembly part. This is where it all comes together. I love this part of the process the best. I like to assemble these rings and anything contoured in between the cavities in my silicone molds so that they just won't roll around as much as I'm working on them. I'm using a thick royal icing glue, basically a brown icing that matches the dough color, to stick these sides together. The thicker the icing is, the faster it'll dry, so I always use a thick icing for glue. Now this would be the stage where you'd want to apply borders if you want a more finished look on the edge of the cookies. First you'd apply it on the top, let it completely dry, and flip it over and apply it on the bottom. But I think I'm going to go for a more rough look, and if I decide at the end that I want to add borders, I can always do that, and I can show you how to do that if that's the case. Okay, next part of the assembly process is I like to start by applying my anchor elements, those being the bigger elements. I find that my design just comes together much better if I get the big pieces positioned first and then fill in with small stuff. So I'm placing my ferns, 2 different colors of the ferns, on opposing sides. Whoops, it's a little unsteady here on the back side of the silicone mold. I might have to flip it over, but I'm going to try to get through this step here on the back side of the mold. Again, I'm using my thick royal icing glue just to place these big pieces down, and at this point it's a little bit like a puzzle. I do have to jockey things around while the icing is still wet and make sure that I've got the big pieces positioned before I add the small ones. So I'm going to take that fern off. I think I like that flower planted right there, and then I'm going to stick that other fern back into the upper left. And once that's in, I'll flip the silicone mold over. I think the ring will sit more stable in the actual cavity as opposed to between them. But let me get this fern on first. There we go. That's looking pretty good. Yeah, that's a lot better. Now that my anchor pieces are on, it's time to put in the small pieces. I like to fill in with the small red flowers and also the fondant berries, just to fill in the holes underneath the larger pieces. And then, of course, a little bit of bling in the form of sugar beads. These are large 4 to 5 millimeter dragées, the source of which can be found in the video description. Now I'm looking at this and I think I do want to add a border at this point. So that is possible. You just have to pipe a little bit more carefully and around the flowers. I'm going to put a simple beaded border on here using icing of beadwork consistency. And again, once it's dry and the top arrangement is dry, I can flip it over and do the border on the back side and also border out the seam. There's a seam on the back side that I haven't yet covered. If I want to, I can put a border around that. Now, different border options. I'm doing a single beaded border, but you can do shell borders, or you can do a double beaded border, as you can see in the upper left corner where I've put ivory beads down and then filled in between with brown beads. Onto the leaves, I'm using a 352 or 350 leaf tip here, and you can get a variegated leaf like the one I just piped by applying pressure, pulling back, applying pressure, pulling back, and then finally releasing. Or you can do a straight leaf like this last one just by applying pressure, gently pulling back, and then releasing. So again, for a straight leaf, apply pressure, pull back. If you want something more variegated, vary the pressure with which you pipe before you release the pastry bag. Now I'm viewing this from all angles to make sure all holes are filled, and there's still some holes here in the upper part that I want to fill with leaves, and then we're nearly done. Looks beautiful. And again, you'd want that bouquet to completely dry and the border as well before I flipped it over and finished out the border on the back side, but the process would be exactly the same. Once it's dried, just slip in your favorite napkin and set it on a plate, and it makes a beautiful display, especially for Thanksgiving. So that was pretty easy. What did I tell you? If you think you're up for another and bigger textured cookie challenge, please jump on over to my video about the Harvest cookie box, which you see up here. It actually uses many of the same molds, such as the Wilton Fern mold and the First Impressions flower molds, but it uses the slightly different wood grain textured mats on the sides. It's also part of a special video collaboration with some of my favorite YouTube friends who are all using Wilton molds in a variety of different ways. So jump on over to that video and have a happy Thanksgiving. Till next video, live sweetly.